6 words tore MAGA apart. 2 names, 1 room, millions watching, and then silence. J.D. Vance looked Pam Bondi dead in the eye and said, "I won't cover your crimes." No one moved. The room, once humming with smug certainty, cracked open. This wasn't a policy dispute. This was a betrayal televised. In a hearing that was supposed to be routine, one senator shattered the unity of a movement that prided itself on loyalty. In 37 seconds, everything changed. Pam's face drained. JD's voice didn't shake. And when the camera zoomed in, America saw something it hadn't seen in years: accountability from within. But was it courage or calculation? Was J.D. Vance exposing corruption or launching his own play for power? As we walk you through the confrontation that left a party divided and a country holding its breath, remember, what you're about to hear is a dramatized account inspired by real figures and real tensions. The events are fictional, but the emotions, the questions, and the truths we explore are very, very real. Because sometimes it takes fiction to tell the truth that no one dares to say. Whose side are you on? So don't blink, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how one moment of truth cracked the mask and changed everything. It wasn't supposed to be there. J.D. Vance had seen plenty of confidential documents in his time: sealed folders stamped eyes only, midnight memos slid across mahogany tables, hushed briefings where nobody dared breathe too loud. But this one felt different. The envelope sat on the polished walnut desk like a sleeping animal. Yellowed slightly at the edges. No name, no address, just one word: confidential, typed in bold red ink across the center. A thumbprint, someone else's, stained the top left corner. J.D. hesitated. He glanced toward the hearing room beyond the frosted glass door. Just a few minutes until the Oversight Committee reconvened. Staffers whispered like distant waves. Someone coughed. The scrape of a leather chair echoed across marble floors. But in here, in his private congressional office, time had slowed to a crawl. Something about the envelope's weight felt personal. He broke the seal. Inside, 4 crisp pages and a flash drive. He skimmed the first line, then stopped. Subject: undisclosed foreign transactions. Committee member P. Bondi. His pulse ticked up. Pam Bondi, a senior MAGA loyalist, a media darling, and until this moment, J.D.'s political ally, however uneasy their alliance had grown in recent months. But this was no tabloid rumor. This was precise, cold, lethal. Exhibit A: private share purchases executed 72 hours before a Qatar infrastructure deal was made public. Exhibit B: shell companies traced to a Delaware address, matching Bondi's driver's license records. Exhibit C: redacted transcripts suggesting coordination between a Qatari intermediary and Bondi's Senate Chief of Staff. J.D.'s eyes darted to the flash drive. His hand hovered above it like it might burn him. Why me? Who had left this? Why now? And what the hell were they expecting him to do with it? Suddenly, the leather walls of the office felt tighter, the air colder. A vent above his head gave a mechanical sigh. He looked again at the pages. In the margins were handwritten notes, some in red, some in blue. Not his handwriting, not Bondi's either. Someone had studied this, highlighted connections, circled bank names, drew arrows between lines of text like they were assembling a case. Someone had gone to great lengths not to bury this, but to make sure J.D. Vance saw it first. A noise outside snapped him back. The hearing room door creaked open. A few voices drifted in, someone laughing, someone nervous. Bondi herself passed by the glass, her heels clicking like metronome ticks, confident, sharp, as if nothing in her world had just shattered. J.D. stared at her silhouette, then at the envelope, then back to her. Could she really have thought no one would find out? Or worse, did she believe everyone already knew and just didn't care? That thought chilled him. His party had survived lies before, scandals, secret payoffs, but foreign influence at this level? It could collapse everything. The entire MAGA base was built on outrage, patriotism, and control of the narrative. What if the foundation was bought and sold behind closed doors, And now, he was holding the detonator. JD folded the documents back into the envelope, slid the flash drive into his coat pocket, and stood. But something in him had changed. He'd come into this hearing planning to defend party lines, play the familiar game of evasive answers and choreographed outrage. Now the script in his head was blank. He walked slowly toward the door, his heartbeat steady, but there was an ache behind his eyes, like he knew he was about to become the villain to half the room, the traitor to the rest. As his hand reached the doorknob, he looked one last time at the desk. The envelope was gone, except it wasn't. Not really, because now everything was about to be different. The door creaked open with a whisper that felt louder than it should have. JD stepped into the hearing chamber, his grip still tight around the inner pocket of his suit where the flash drive now rested. The room hadn't changed in the last 5 minutes, but somehow it had. Or maybe it was just him. The overhead lights still cast that sterile blue hue over the mahogany desks. The marble still gleamed. The congressional seal still loomed from the wall like an ever-watchful eye. And then she walked in. Pam Bondi entered as if it were a coronation, chin high, blazer tailored to perfection, eyes sharp as courtroom steel. She didn't walk. She claimed space. Her heels echoed down the corridor of committee chairs like war drums, and for a brief moment, JD almost forgot what he'd just read. The room, as if on cue, shifted in her direction. Reporters straightened, staffers turned. One aide even whispered, "She's glowing today," as if this were Fashion Week, not a federal hearing. She wore red, a bold choice, and not just any red, but the kind that dares someone to look away. It wasn't just her clothes, it was the way she moved. The way her smile was pinned in place like a pageant ribbon. It was all so perfectly calibrated. But JD now could see the machinery underneath. The smile didn't reach her eyes. The confidence had a pattern, a rhythm too clean to be real. She was rehearsed, weaponized. Pam slid into her chair with grace and ownership, nodding slightly toward the committee chair, who acknowledged her like one does a familiar friend. JD took his seat across from her, his eyes scanning the room, noticing who looked at her with admiration and who didn't look at her at all. He felt it again, that low hum of moral static in his chest. The documents were still fresh in his mind, the damning evidence now pulsing like a second heartbeat. JD had been assigned to this session as a procedural body. No questioning, no confrontation, just observe and vote. Rubber stamp theater. But now, his fingers tapped slowly against the desk. Pam leaned back and folded her arms, exchanging light banter with the senator to her left. She looked untouched, untouchable. And that's when it hit JD. She didn't think anyone would dare. Not in this room, not in this party, not him. He looked down at his notepad. The lines were empty, but in his mind, they were filled with questions. Questions he wasn't supposed to ask. Questions that could fracture everything. What if this is my moment? He'd fought hard to get here, fought harder to keep his party together through chaos, Trump-era fatigue and scandal fatigue layered on top. But there came a point, a line thin as a hair and sharp as glass, when silence became complicity, and the truth now sat like a weight on his chest. He glanced again across the table. Pam was laughing now, that same pageant smile. She had no idea, or maybe she did, and had calculated, correctly until now, that no one in this room would ever risk exposing her, especially not him. He exhaled, slow and heavy, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough that his ribs hurt. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know which side of the table he was sitting on, and somewhere inside, a new voice was beginning to rise. Not loud, not yet, but steady. If I don't speak now, when? And if not me, who? Outside, cameras were rolling. Inside, everything still looked normal. But JD knew. This was no longer just another hearing. This was the quiet before the break. And he had already stepped across the line, whether he liked it or not. JD's fingers were still. The internal tremble now found no refuge in motion. All around him, the procedural rhythm of the hearing began as expected. Statements from the chair, acknowledgments, gentle formalities that built the illusion of control. But beneath that calm surface, JD's blood was heating. His pulse had taken on a rhythm of its own. Pam Bondi was just 3 seats away, radiant and unreadable, her smile poised like a blade. She still had no idea he'd seen the file. Or maybe she did, and she was daring him to say something. The chair cleared his throat, beginning the usual preamble about today's objectives. JD heard none of it. Every word from the dais blurred into static. He wasn't supposed to speak today. That was the arrangement. His staff had even printed his name placard without a microphone indicator. Just a formality. He was there to sit, nod, vote, and keep the walls from cracking. But something in him had already shifted, and cracks, once formed, don't close themselves. Then without ceremony, without cue, JD leaned forward. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice sharper than expected, "point of inquiry. May I pose a direct question to the witness?" The chair blinked. Everyone else turned. Even Pam. There was a pause, just long enough for a ripple of confusion to pass across the dais. I believe Senator Vance is not slated to question during this session," the chair stammered. JD didn't flinch. "I understand. But in light of new information I believe is relevant to the committee's integrity and the public interest, I respectfully request the floor." A longer silence. The kind of silence that feels like you've cracked open the air itself. The chair hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. "Proceed, briefly." JD turned, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes met Pam's. She didn't look away. She didn't smile either. Her expression was a mirror, flawless, opaque. He inhaled once, and then dropped the first hammer. "Ms. Bondi, for the record, have you ever registered as a foreign agent under the FARA Act in relation to any advisory, strategic, or legal services provided to Qatar?" It was like someone unplugged the room. The lights didn't dim, but it felt darker. Every shuffle, every breath, every idle scribble froze in place. Pam didn't answer, not at first. JD watched her. The precision in her posture had faltered, just slightly. Her eyelids blinked once, slower than normal. It was the kind of blink that says this was not in the script. "I'm sorry, Senator," she said, voice low but steady. "Could you clarify the basis of your question?" It was a stall. JD knew it. She knew it. So did half the room. "I asked," he repeated, voice unshaken, "if you ever registered as a foreign agent under FARA for any professional ties to Qatar, or if you failed to, despite receiving compensation for advising entities connected to the Qatari government or its proxies." A soft gasp escaped from somewhere behind the witness chairs, the kind of sound people make when they know they've just seen the first match light the edge of a fuse. Pam's lips parted, then closed. This time, she blinked twice. The chair adjusted his glasses. Someone in the gallery dropped a pen. JD leaned back slowly, as if placing the weight of that single question into the center of the table, daring anyone to touch it. He didn't need to say more, not yet. Because in Washington, silence is sometimes the loudest answer of all. The pause hung heavy. Pam Bondi's eyes shifted, first to the chair, then briefly to her own counsel, seated just beyond the dais, a nonverbal dance of strategy and progress. JD didn't need an answer immediately. He had already seen what mattered. The flicker behind her eyes, that split second of calculation, and now she was about to perform, to pivot, to protect the narrative. "I believe," she began slowly, drawing her words out like silk, "that the senator may be misinformed regarding the nature of my work. My involvement with entities in the Gulf region, if we must frame it that way, was solely in the interest of combating human trafficking. That's something I've committed my life to. Children, women, vulnerable communities." Her voice crescendoed, gaining polish with every syllable. The delivery was practiced, righteous. She even leaned forward slightly as though giving the cameras a clearer shot of conviction. "To conflate national security advocacy with personal gain is not only inaccurate, Senator, it is dangerous." There it was, the Bondi maneuver. Deflect, reframe, accuse. Several committee members shifted in their seats. A few murmurs behind JD suggested sympathy, or perhaps discomfort at how public this had become. And yet JD didn't respond with outrage or interruption. He waited, patiently, like someone setting a trap and letting the silence become bait. Then almost casually, he picked up a manila folder from his desk. The room stilled again. JD held it in both hands, thumbed the flap open, and drew out a single sheet of paper, highlighted in yellow, crisp with the sheen of being printed just that morning. "Ms. Bondi," he said, voice low and clear, "on February 25th, you sold $1.1 million worth of Trump media stock, just hours before the former president announced his new policy proposal on foreign-owned digital infrastructure, a proposal that caused that same stock to plummet by over 20%. Pam's lips parted, but JD didn't stop. That trade was executed at 9:42 a.m. Trump's announcement went public at 11:03. Your advisory board role at the time, according to this record, he tapped the document once lightly, was still active. So I ask again, were you operating under any confidentiality agreements that would have allowed you to know about that policy before it was made public? She didn't blink this time, but her body told the story. Shoulders too still, jaw too tense. In politics, the absence of movement can be more revealing than a scream. I act based on my conscience, Senator, Pam said softer now, and on the legal counsel provided to me in every transaction I've ever made. It was a beautifully empty sentence. JD tilted his head slightly. I'm not asking about your conscience, Ms. Bondi. I'm asking about coordination. Did you or did you not benefit financially from non-public knowledge obtained through your connections to Trump media or its associated political operations? The oxygen in the room seemed thinner now. Bondi opened her mouth, then paused. I've already answered your question, she said, but her voice was flatter. Less fire, more calculation. JD didn't smile, but his stillness now had its own gravity. He didn't need to press harder. The question had done its work. The room knew it. America, watching through live stream and newsfeed, would know it soon enough. What had begun as a symbolic hearing was turning into a high-voltage deposition. Pam Bondi had entered expecting admiration. Now she was navigating landmines, and JD, once seated quietly on the edge, was guiding the storm from within. And this storm had only just begun. The silence after JD's final question was broken not by Pam Bondi's words, but by the sound of her chair scraping back slightly as she leaned forward, knuckles pale against the polished wood of the witness table. Her voice, when it came, was tight with indignation, almost cracking under its own weight. So now you question me, JD? She said, the syllables clipped. After everything we fought for? I've stood with this movement, your movement, from the beginning. When the media laughed, I showed up. When donors fled, I stayed. When they called us dangerous, I called it patriotism. Her voice rose now, riding the edge of fury. You may sit there and thumb your papers, but don't you dare question my loyalty to the flag. JD didn't flinch, didn't look away. He let the words settle like dust on polished marble. I don't question the flag, Pam, he said finally, calm and low. I question those who wave it while selling what it stands for. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The weight of it landed like a thunderclap wrapped in velvet. Pam's mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but no words came. Somewhere behind her, one of her aides adjusted their earpiece, suddenly very still. The chair looked up, sensing something irreversible beginning to unfold, but hesitant to interfere. JD turned a page in the folder. Another document came into view, this one printed on the letterhead of the Senate Intelligence Subcommittee. Its bold header, Qatar U.S. Investment Exchange, private briefing notes. His voice remained even, but the room had begun to lean forward with him. In April of last year, JD began, you traveled to Doha as part of a private economic delegation. That visit was never publicly disclosed. According to this classified memorandum, he tapped the page gently, you met with 3 Qatari sovereign fund directors. Within 90 days of that trip, 2 of those funds funneled capital into a U.S.-based shell company, which later purchased media holdings linked to political messaging platforms in Michigan, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. He looked up. And just weeks later, you delivered a keynote speech at a political passé conference, championing their sudden expansion. Pam's gaze had darkened. but her voice remained collected. Senator Vance, international engagement is part of any serious effort to protect American values. Those meetings were cleared through informal channels, and none of them involved personal financial gain. JD didn't blink. Then why, he asked softly, did you sign the LLC founding documents under a pseudonym? The air in the room became a vice, every breath a negotiation. For a moment, Pam said nothing. Then she laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. We're really going to play it like this? She asked, her eyes scanning the room now, not just JD. I'm not your enemy, JD. I've stood by you when others ran. But if you're going to question my motives on national television, then understand this. You're tearing down the very movement we both helped build. JD leaned back slightly, letting her words ring out. No, he replied quietly. I'm saving it from the people who've mistaken the movement for a marketplace. That did it. A low stir moved through the committee. Staffers exchanged glances. Phones buzzed quietly as notes were passed. The hearing was no longer procedural, it was existential. What had started as a formal examination had become a reckoning, not just for Pam Bondi, but for the image of unity MAGA had sold for years. And J.D. Vance, once its quiet son, was peeling back the curtain. J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut the room sharper than steel when he began reading from the final document in his folder. His tone was even, deliberate, an executioner reading a verdict rather than a senator airing an inquiry. This line, he said, tapping the page, is from the official transcript of your Senate confirmation hearing. When asked directly whether you had ever met with or received financial assets connected to a foreign government, you responded, quote, never, not once. I serve only this nation. J.D. paused, then looked up. And yet, he continued, according to the investment trail disclosed just now, there were 3 separate interactions involving you, Qatari entities, and concealed U.S. corporate structures, none of which were disclosed to the Senate Judiciary Committee during that hearing. The silence that followed was unnatural, not the polite stillness of protocol, but the hollow stillness of impact, of a blow landing squarely and no one daring to move. Pam Bondi, once poised and polished behind her microphone, suddenly sat rigid. Her eyes darted toward her team, but no one came to her rescue. No one moved at all. And then her fury cracked the air like a whip. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor, and slammed her palm flat on the table. The chamber jolted. You ungrateful coward, she spat, her finger stabbing the space between them. I gave everything for MAGA. I bled for this movement. And you dare to stab it in the back, in front of cameras? In front of them? The word them carried venom. She didn't need to explain who she meant. J.D. remained seated, his posture unflinching. His face gave nothing away, save for a stillness that was more powerful than rage. You think you're noble? Pam continued, voice rising, trembling now. You think this makes you a patriot? All you've done is hand the media their dream headline. You've made yourself a traitor to your own. J.D. exhaled slowly. He didn't rush his words. He didn't even speak loudly. Pam, he said almost gently, I've sat in silence while the truth got bartered away in private rooms. I've sat in silence while flags were wrapped around lies like a gift box. And for too long, that silence felt like loyalty. Then for the first time, his voice sharpened. But it's not. Silence isn't loyalty. Silence is betrayal. The final word echoed, not just in the chamber, but in the hollow spaces behind people's ribs. Pam didn't reply, couldn't. She simply stared, as if the man she once called ally had turned to stone in front of her. Behind her, cameras whirred faintly. Somewhere a pen dropped. No one reached down to pick it up. The chair of the committee shifted awkwardly in his seat, uncertain whether to intervene or simply let history write itself without obstruction. J.D. looked down and slowly closed the folder. Not slammed, not flung, just folded it closed with reverence, like a priest shutting a worn Bible. Around him, the chamber remained frozen. But the silence now was not from shock. It was from understanding. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in the hearing room. The corridor outside the hearing room wasn't silent. It pulsed with whispers. Conversations halted the moment J.D. passed by, some out of respect, others out of calculation. A few aides offered him solemn nods, the kind reserved for soldiers returning from battles that should have never needed to be fought. Others avoided eye contact entirely, like glancing at him might implicate them too. The rift was forming, and fast. Within hours, right-wing circles were splintering. On one end, JD was hailed by a few as the man who finally stood up to the machine inside the movement. "Courageous," one headline read. "JD Vance draws the line," said another. But the blowback was louder, more venomous. "Traitor," "turncoat," "globalist in disguise." Some of his old allies on Capitol Hill refused to speak with him. Others sent veiled messages through intermediaries. "This isn't how we fix things." JD had heard that phrase before. It always meant leave the rod alone if the tree still bears fruit. He stood at the window in his office that evening, tie loosened, shirt sleeves rolled up, but his thoughts were elsewhere, far from D.C., far from Bondi, and far from the rising tide of chaos. They were in a ballroom in 2016. He remembered the first time he met Trump. It wasn't glamorous, no golden elevator, no stage lights, just a fundraiser in Ohio, chairs half filled, donors half skeptical. Trump wasn't polished. He stumbled over names, repeated lines, cracked jokes that didn't always land. But when he locked eyes with JD across the room, something about him felt raw. Not real, maybe, but something that felt like it wanted to be real. Later that night, over drinks and handshakes, Trump had leaned in and said, "You know why I win? Because I make people believe in something, even if they don't know what it is yet." JD had nodded, because at the time, that had felt like power. That belief carried them through the rallies, the jeers, the storms. JD wasn't blind. He knew the flaws, the chaos, the contradictions. But he had once believed that behind all the noise was a man who, in his own messy way, believed back. Now standing in that window, watching the Capitol lights flicker across glass, JD knew something had broken. Not in Trump, in the people who clung to him like a golden lifeboat, using his name to shield whatever profit or privilege they didn't want questioned. People like Pam. Bondi hadn't betrayed the movement today. She'd exposed what it had become in the hands of those who saw it as a tool, not a mission. And JD, he'd helped build that tool. He couldn't deny that now. A knock came at the door. An aide leaned in, awkward. "Senator, they're saying Fox News is prepping a full segment calling you a deep state operative." JD didn't flinch. "Of course they are. They also want a response, a statement, maybe even an apology if you're willing." JD turned from the window. His face was calm, but his voice had a heaviness, the kind that settles into a man's ribs when he's finally told the truth and knows there's no going back. "No statement," he said. "Let the silence say more than I can." The aide hesitated. "And tomorrow's schedule?" JD looked down at the folder still resting on his desk, the one labeled Qatar. The papers weren't scattered. He had reassembled them with precision. "Clear it," he said. "We're not done." The next morning, the hearing resumed under a gray sky. Rain traced thin lines down the windows, like the building itself was weeping for what was about to unfold. The mood in the chamber had shifted, no longer just tense, now combustible. The kindling had been laid yesterday. Today, JD would strike the match. Pam Bondi sat upright, sharp in a red blazer that practically dared anyone to question her patriotism. Her eyes flicked over the room like a hawk, but JD noticed her grip on the table, tight, white-knuckled. He waited until the formalities ended. Then, against his prior instructions to remain silent, he pressed the button on his mic. A familiar soft chime echoed as it turned green. All eyes turned to him again. "Ms. Bondi," JD began, calm but deliberate, "you've testified that your advisory role to the president is purely voluntary. No salary, no benefit, just service." Pam gave a tight smile, leaning toward the mic. "That's correct." He nodded. "And yet, while serving in that role, you held over $1.2 million in Trump media stock. Is that also correct?" Her jaw tensed. She glanced briefly to her left. An aide shifted uncomfortably behind her. "My investments are disclosed per ethics guidelines." JD interrupted gently. "I didn't ask if they were disclosed. I asked if you held them while advising policy that directly affected their valuation. For instance, the president's statement last June about social media deregulation. The market jumped 10% that same day, and you sold 2 days later. Pam's mouth opened, then closed. The room went still. JD leaned in, voice lowering just enough to force everyone to listen more closely. You speak for the president. You claim to fight for the movement. But I have one question, Ms. Bondi, and I want a clear answer. Pam sat motionless, waiting for it like a woman bracing against a wave. Are you the president's voice? JD asked. Or are you just another account manager for your own portfolio? The blow landed harder than any shouted accusation. Even the stenographer's typing faltered. For several seconds, Bondi didn't answer. Her tongue pressed against the inside of her cheek. Her eyes narrowed, not out of confusion, but fury. The kind of fury that comes not from being wronged, but from being seen too clearly. I don't dignify insinuations that question my loyalty, she snapped. My record speaks for itself. JD didn't raise his voice. It does, and so do your trades. She pointed a finger across the table. You're doing the left's work for them. No, JD replied coldly. I'm trying to salvage what we claimed we believed in. The air crackled. For a moment, even the most die-hard staffers, those who had once worn MAGA hats like armor, looked uncertain. The movement that had prided itself on loyalty, on fighting them, was now fighting within. JD wasn't just questioning Bondi. He was putting the entire creed of America First on trial. She stared at him, eyes blazing, but still said nothing more. JD turned off his mic slowly. He didn't need a dramatic flourish. The silence that followed did the speaking for him. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifted. Not just in the room, but in the country. The audience that had tuned in for another show was now witnessing a reckoning. This wasn't a political drama anymore. It was a funeral. And MAGA, it seemed, had brought the match to its own flag. The air inside the chamber was no longer tense. It was vacant, like a cathedral after the last hymn. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. No one dared speak, not because of respect, but because no one knew what side they were on anymore. JD sat still, fingers pressed together, elbows on the table. Across from him, Pam Bondi remained upright, her jaw locked, her expression unreadable. But he noticed her chest rise sharply, once, then again. Controlled breathing, fury restrained. He had not raised his voice. He had not hurled insults. And yet, what he said had cut deeper than anything shouted from a protest line. Pam leaned into her mic one final time. Her voice was cool, but the tremor beneath it betrayed her. This hearing has become a circus, she said, and I refuse to be part of a spectacle designed to divide patriots. Then she stood. No folder gathered, no closing words, no nod to the committee chair. She just walked out, high heels clicking against polished marble, each step ringing louder than the last. The doors didn't slam behind her, but the silence they left might as well have been an explosion. JD didn't watch her go. He stared down at the grain of the desk, tracing the edge with one finger. In the stillness, the earlier fire that had burned in him had gone cold. What replaced it was not pride, not vindication, but something hollower. Across the room, murmurs began to rise, uncertain, scattered. Some aides typed hurried messages. Others looked to one another, unsure whether to follow Pam or stay seated. A few members of the committee sat in stunned stillness, as if they just realized they'd witnessed a point of no return. Chairman Harper cleared his throat, unsure of whether to adjourn or not. JD didn't hear him. His mind was elsewhere, suspended in that one moment that now echoed in him like a final verdict. He remembered the question he hadn't planned to ask, but couldn't keep in. Do you think MAGA will die because of Democrats? He'd said. No, it'll die because of silence. It hadn't been meant as an accusation. It had been a confession. Because silence, his silence, had protected so much for so long. Now the words had been said, the mask removed, and in its place, ruin. The press pool outside would seize this. The headlines would write themselves. Bondi storms out, Vance breaks ranks, MAGA implodes on live TV. But none of that mattered to him now. Not the noise, not the backlash. What gnawed at him was deeper. He had once stood beside Bondi at rallies, shared backstages, shared victory speeches, shared loyalty. And now, she didn't look back. Not once. He closed his eyes. There was no applause, no vindication. Just a chair now cold beneath him, a nameplate in front of him, and a nation watching from behind screens, wondering what they had just witnessed and why it felt so familiar. This wasn't about one question, one hearing, one woman. It was about what happens when loyalty becomes blindness, when unity becomes complicity, when patriotism becomes a brand. J.D. Vance had not turned on the movement had turned on itself. And in the hush that followed her exit, he realized something chilling. The loudest betrayal is often spoken in silence. He didn't sleep that night. J.D. sat in the glow of his kitchen's overhead light, long after the last headline had faded from the news crawl. His phone screen, face down on the table, buzzed quietly every few minutes. Short pulses like warnings before a storm. He turned it over. Messages flooded in. From campaign consultants, "You'll need to clarify your position fast." From Senate colleagues, "You made your point, JD, now let it go." From a party whip, "We don't eat our own," or "Hadn't you heard?" And then, quietly, cutting deeper than the rest, his old friend Marcus, someone who'd stood beside him from the first state race in Ohio, someone who'd shared bourbon and prayers in hotel hallways before debates, texted one line, "You've ruined everything." No anger, just disappointment. As if JD had betrayed a covenant, not with ideology, but with belonging. He didn't respond. Instead, hours later, he found himself sitting at his dressing table. A dim bulb overhead hummed faintly. His reflection stared back. Creased brow, tired eyes, tie loosened, but still clinging to his collar like a noose of duty. He looked older, not in years, but in spirit, as if some boyish myth he'd once carried, the belief that truth, if spoken bravely, would inspire respect, had finally fully collapsed. He pressed both palms flat on the table, leaned forward slightly and studied himself. Not the senator, not the rising star, just a man alone in his silence. Outside, morning began bleeding across the sky. The blue turned orange, then pale. Another day of calls would come, strategists pretending to care, reporters pretending to understand, staffers pretending to protect. But JD knew what was coming now, not because anyone had said it, but because no one needed to. He went back to his phone, scrolled down past the threats, the feigned concern, until he found one that made him pause. It was short, from a junior aide who rarely spoke up in meetings. "Thank you. I saw what you did. We all saw. They're just afraid to say it." He read it 3 times. Then again. Then let the phone drop onto the table with a soft clack. He didn't reply. He couldn't, not yet. Because the truth was, he didn't know what he'd really done. Had he stood up, or simply burned a bridge no one was ever going to let him cross again? The line between integrity and career suicide was razor thin, and in these halls, loyalty wasn't earned. It was enforced. The night before, when Pam Bondi walked out, he had imagined the cost would be public, loud, violent. But this was worse. It was quiet, a freezing out, invitations withdrawn, meetings suddenly postponed, eye contact avoided in elevators. The language of exile wasn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it came in the form of too polite emails and group chats that suddenly stopped buzzing. He had stood in that chamber and spoken because he thought the truth mattered more than the script. Now the script was writing him out. And yet, he wasn't sorry, not yet. Not even as the first staffer texted, "They're reassigning your judiciary subcommittee seat." Not even as an old donor posted a vague but pointed tweet, "Disappointed in the people I once believed in." Not even as the silence grew louder. He stood from the mirror, straightened his tie, stepped toward the window and watched the sun crest above the Capitol dome, wondering, not what came next, but who might still be watching. Somewhere out there, someone had seen, someone had heard, and maybe, just maybe, the silence wasn't empty. Maybe it was waiting. The wind was sharp that morning, But JD chose to walk. He left the Capitol behind and took the long way down Constitution Avenue, coat unbuttoned, collar up. His phone buzzed again, likely another journalist wanting a quote, or a party official offering a half-smile veiled in reprimand, but he ignored it. The messages were all the same now. Noise masquerading as necessity. Today he wasn't looking for politics. He was looking for something real. He found it in a community center just off Pennsylvania. The kind with cracked linoleum floors and folded chairs that creaked under history. A small gathering of veterans had invited him, though only one man really mattered. The one sitting quietly in the corner, arms crossed over a jacket 2 sizes too large. Sergeant Ronald Blake. JD had read about him. Decorated Marine, former Capitol Police officer, arrested on January 6th, not for violence, but for being present in a restricted area. One of the so-called gray zone patriots, used, discarded, and then forgotten. The party he'd risked everything for barely mentioned his name now. When JD approached, the man looked up, not with awe or deference, but a tired kind of clarity. "You wanted to talk?" the veteran asked. JD nodded. He didn't launch into apology. He didn't explain votes or headlines. He just sat. They spoke for a while, about betrayal, about the strange weight of silence, about how fast people disappear when the party shifts. And then Sergeant Blake leaned in, his voice graveled and low. "I don't need you to defend me, Senator. Don't need speeches or press conferences." JD held his gaze. "I just need to know," the man said, "that I didn't believe in the wrong person." The words cut through everything JD had been carrying. All the justifications, all the political equations, all the fears. This wasn't about MAGA anymore. It wasn't about Bondi or Trump or committees or donors. It was about this one man and millions like him who had believed, not in spectacle, but in service. JD didn't respond right away. He couldn't. He thought of Bondi again, how easily she twisted patriotism into profit, how quickly she wrapped herself in the flag as a shield against questions, and how close he had come to staying quiet, because it would have been easier, because it would have protected him. But what was the difference between silence and complicity? If he had swallowed the truth to save his standing, would he really be any different from the woman he had exposed? The question turned in his chest like a blade. He stood slowly, as if rising from more than just a chair. "Sergeant," he said, his voice firm, but without theatrics, "you didn't believe in the wrong person?" The older man nodded once. That was it. No handshake, no photo, no viral moment. Just the silent passing of something weightier than words. Conviction. JD stepped back into the wind, hands in pockets, heart still burning. Because in that small room, he hadn't been the senator or the dissenter. He had been a mirror. And in that reflection, he'd finally seen the line he couldn't uncross. The silence would not save him. It never saved anyone. By the time JD Vance returned to his office, the day had begun to blur into evening. The halls were quieter now. Fewer reporters, fewer footsteps echoing with judgment. The headlines had already spun their conclusions, but he wasn't reading them. He had work to do, not the kind measured in bills or subcommittees, but in truth. The kind of work that started at a desk when no one was watching. He sat down, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This time he wasn't drafting a statement for the press or an op-ed tailored to please both sides. He was writing something simpler, something harder, a speech for tomorrow's hearing, not to interrogate, not to accuse, to speak. He glanced at the stack of letters on his desk, some from veterans, some from old friends, some unsigned but unmistakable in their tone. Betrayal, disappointment, threats cloaked in patriotism. He didn't move them. He didn't need reminders. What he needed was honesty and resolve. He started from the middle, not the beginning. The first words that came weren't political. They were human. Conviction doesn't require a camera. He paused, then kept writing. The words poured out, not like a waterfall, but like a controlled flame. Precise, patient, deliberate. He was no longer trying to defend his decisions. He was trying to light a path for those still caught in the fog of loyalty and fear. For the ones who hadn't yet spoken, but felt the weight of silence growing heavier by the day. He wasn't naive. He knew what it meant to break ranks. The party would ice him out, donors would vanish, and the headlines would keep spinning. But there was something colder than all of that. Something he'd tasted in Bondi's smirk and in his own mirror. The coldness of a man who stopped believing his words mattered. He wouldn't be that man. He wrote through dusk and into the start of night. His back ached, his eyes burned, but still he kept going, until he reached the final line. The room was quiet as he typed it, 16 words that had sat inside him since the moment Sergeant Blake looked him in the eye and refused pity. If the fire consumes everything, then let me be the one who carries what remains. He stared at the sentence. It wasn't clever. It wasn't partisan. It was a promise. He leaned back in his chair, finally exhaling. The Capitol lights blinked through his window. Somewhere below, the city kept moving, oblivious, or perhaps just numb. JD didn't know which anymore. But tomorrow he would walk into that chamber not to fight, but to remind. Remind them all, Democrat or Republican, loyalist or dissenter, that movements don't survive on rage alone, that principles, once buried beneath slogans and silence, can't be resurrected by noise, only by courage. And if that courage meant walking alone, so be it. He folded the printed speech carefully. No edits, no revisions. It was already complete. He turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into soft shadow. The fire was coming. He knew it. But this time he wasn't running from it. He would walk into it, with one ember in his hand. The room was full when J.D. Vance walked back into the chamber. Same carpet, same walls, same cameras. But something was different now. Him. There was no longer hesitation in his steps, no tug of war in his chest. Only clarity. A quiet clarity that sharpened his voice the moment he leaned toward the mic. "Ms. Bondi," he began, "you've said repeatedly that your actions were always in service of the president. So I'd like to clarify something that has, until now, remained deliberately foggy." Pam Bondi sat straighter, her posture rigid, lips pursed in a smile, too polished to be sincere. JD continued, calm but precise. "Do you believe that the blanket pardon reportedly drafted for January 6 defendants also covers crimes committed after the riot?" A rustle spread through the gallery. Staffers lifted their heads. Reporters paused mid-keystroke. Bondi tilted her head, an eyebrow raised. "Senator, with respect, that falls squarely under the constitutional authority of the executive branch. The president's right to grant pardons is well established." JD didn't flinch. "I didn't ask about rights, I asked about limits." She hesitated, then shifted in her seat. "Well, any such discussion is speculative. There was no formal issuance, and hypotheticals can—" JD cut in. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the steel of someone who'd already done the burning. "I'm not interested in what a president can do. I'm asking what a nation should allow." Silence stretched for a beat too long. Pam tried again. "The pardon power is broad. That's not in dispute." JD leaned forward. "Then let me rephrase. If a presidential pardon is used not to forgive, but to erase accountability for those who continue to act in bad faith, does that still fall under patriotism?" Bondi's expression faltered for the first time. JD didn't stop. "Let's say someone stormed the Capitol, was forgiven, and then, emboldened by that forgiveness, went on to threaten witnesses, intimidate jurors, obstruct justice. Would that, in your view, still be shielded under the same flag you say you serve?" She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at her legal advisor, who subtly shook his head. She turned back, tone clipped. "Senator, I represent interests that believe in constitutional integrity, not hypotheticals designed to sow distrust." JD exhaled softly, a wry smile touching his face. "Constitutional integrity," he echoed. "That's a beautiful phrase, but I'm afraid it's being worn like camouflage." The room tensed again. He pressed on. "Because when the Constitution becomes a refuge for people who violate its spirit while clinging to its words, then we've replaced patriotism with opportunism." Bondi folded her arms. "You're questioning the Constitution now?" "No," JD replied. "I'm questioning those who wield it like a shield to avoid moral consequence." For a moment, no one said a word. It wasn't the drama of shouting that shook the room. It was the stillness after truth is spoken, when no one dares break it. JD sat back. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't attacking. He was pulling the thread that others had ignored because they feared where it might lead. Bondi adjusted her mic. "Senator, you're playing a dangerous game." JD looked directly at her. "So is pretending power justifies everything done in its name." No rebuttal came. Instead, the committee chair cleared his throat, sensing the heat rise. "Thank you, Senator. We'll now move to the next question." But no one moved, because JD's words still hung in the air, not as accusation, but as warning. The Constitution was not the trap. Silence was. And for once, someone had chosen to speak. Pam Bondi's fingers tightened around her pen. JD's last words had landed harder than expected. The room still hadn't settled when she leaned toward the mic again, this time with something sharper in her voice. "Senator Vance," she said, "while you fixate on hypotheticals, real crimes are happening, unchecked under President Biden. Hunter Biden's foreign dealings, classified documents mishandled, media silence. Where's the outrage then?" JD didn't interrupt. He let her go on. "Selective prosecution," she added, her voice rising, "is more dangerous than any pardon. We are watching a two-tiered system of justice, and your silence on that is what's truly disappointing." She leaned back, satisfied with the shift. The crowd behind her stirred, sensing momentum. She thought she'd flip the table. JD waited a beat, then calmly placed one hand flat on the table. A soft thud. Nothing dramatic, but it snapped the moment back to him. "So let me understand this," he said, tone measured but laced with steel. "You've just spent 10 minutes telling us President Trump is the moral compass of this country." Bondi arched an eyebrow cautiously. "And yet," JD continued, "when asked about the ethics of pardoning people who committed new crimes after January 6th, your response is to point to Hunter Biden?" She opened her mouth, but he raised a finger, not to silence her, but to finish the point. "You want me to look away, to shift the lens, to compare sins, not confront them." He sat back, letting his words breathe. "I've said it before," he added. "Deflection is not defense. It's fear." The room was still. JD's voice stayed low, but the weight behind it filled the chamber. "I didn't come here today to debate political parties. I came here because there's something sacred about truth, especially when it's inconvenient." He leaned forward again, hands clasped. "You invoke the Constitution, patriotism, rule of law, and yet when it's time to stand in that light, you duck behind the next headline." Bondi tried to recover. "I'm providing context, Senator. You don't get to demand moral purity from one side and excuse the other." JD smiled sadly. "I'm not excusing anything. I'm demanding consistency. That includes President Biden. That includes Hunter. That includes Trump. That includes you." A beat. "You want to know why this country is tired?" JD asked. "It's not because of left or right. It's because no one will stand still long enough to answer a straight question without dragging us through a blame circus." He tapped the table again softly. "So I ask you, Ms. Bondi, once more. Do you believe it's morally right to shelter ongoing criminal behavior behind the name of a movement that once claimed to restore law and order?" She looked to the committee chair, then to her notes, then briefly to the cameras. "No comment," she said finally, voice colder than before. JD nodded. "That's what I thought." He wasn't angry now, just tired. But that tiredness came with clarity. "You claim Trump is the king of moral revival," he said softly, "but you can't answer a moral question without hiding behind talking points and someone else's sins." He pushed his mic slightly away. "So I'll say it plainly. If we need to drag the ghost of Hunter Biden into every hearing to avoid holding our own side accountable, then we've already lost the war for principle." A long silence followed. This wasn't theater. It was reckoning. And Bondi, for all her preparation, had no script for this version of J.D. Vance. For the first time that morning, Pam Bondi looked around and found no lifeline. No senator stepped in to interrupt J.D. No aide whispered in her ear. No one from the gallery raised their voice in defense. The air in the chamber was still, but it pressed down like a weight, thick with unspoken judgment. She shuffled her papers, a reflex more than anything. The hearing had become a mirror, and everyone in the room was forced to see what they had tried so long to avoid. Not just the truth, but their silence around it. J.D. Vance didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at Bondi anymore. He turned to the chair. "Madam Chair," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably final, "I have no further questions." There was a pause, as if the system itself didn't quite know how to react. The chair nodded slowly, then offered the floor back. J.D. didn't take it. Instead, he stood, collected his notes with methodical precision, and looked down at them one last time. Not to review, but to release. These pages, now worn with margin scribbles and underlined phrases, had done their job. They were never meant to win points. As he tucked them into his folder, he cleared his throat gently. "I didn't come here to win," he said to the room at large. "That was never the point." Several heads turned. "I came here to clean up," he added, "to say the things we all know but pretend not to." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet around him amplified every word. "I don't care what jersey someone wears, blue, red, MAGA, progressive. If we can't tell the truth in this room, then this room doesn't matter." Pam Bondi stared at him, her face unreadable now. All her years of courtroom polish couldn't hide the fact that the ground had shifted beneath her. J.D. looked across the rows of silent staffers and press, beyond the faces of senators too frozen to respond. He wasn't expecting applause. That wasn't what this was about. He was prepared to walk out alone, carrying his conscience and the consequences. But just as he turned to leave, something stopped him. A movement, subtle, quiet, from the far end of the chamber. A young aide, probably no older than 24, sitting near the tech console. He wore a gray suit a little too big for his frame, and his tie was slightly crooked. But his expression was clear. As J.D. met his gaze, the aide gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not for politics, not for sides, for truth, for the courage to say it out loud. And in that brief second, J.D. knew something deeper than victory. He knew he wasn't alone. He walked out of the chamber without another word, passing rows of officials who suddenly had a lot less to say. The echo of his steps was the only sound that followed him, but it was steady, certain. Behind him, the silence said more than any gavel could. It was the sound a room makes when it realizes guilt and has nothing left to argue. The buzz of the conference room was supposed to be a homecoming, a chance for J.D. Vance to rally his base, show strength after the hearing, and mend the fractures in the movement. Instead, it felt like a gauntlet. As he entered, the familiar faces of conservative commentators and party stalwarts lined the hallways. But their smiles were thin, and their eyes colder than before. Conversation stalled when he approached. Phones stopped scrolling. Laughter died mid-sentence. Behind the polished veneers of camaraderie lurked sharp criticism. Behind closed doors, whispers escalated to outright condemnation. J.D. had already seen the headlines. Turncoat, Reno, saboteur. The airwaves crackled with talking heads dissecting his every word, painting him as a disruptor, an enemy within. His own allies were now uncertain allies at best. Inside the conference hall, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered. But when J.D. took the podium, the applause was polite but sparse. He scanned the crowd, eyes downcast, hesitant, some deliberately avoiding his gaze. The weight of isolation settled like a stone in his chest. J.D. cleared his throat. His opening line was met with scattered nods but no cheer. The familiar cadence of political speeches felt hollow. As he spoke, the sting of betrayal wrapped tighter. Minutes in, J.D.'s words, meant to inspire, instead seemed to deepen the divide. His call for truth and accountability clashed with the fears of those unwilling to face uncomfortable realities. Halfway through, murmurs rose in the back rows. Phones lit up with live tweets. Some whispered that he was out of step, that he was a liability, that his vision threatened the fragile unity they had. By the time the Q&A began, the tone had shifted irreversibly. Questions weren't genuine inquiries, they were traps, attempts to corner him into retracting, apologizing, walking back. One question cut through the pretense like a knife. Senator Vance, how do you justify turning against the movement that brought you here? JD's answer was measured but unwavering. I'm not turning against anyone. I'm turning toward truth. That was enough. Halfway through the session, an aide handed JD a note, a terse message. Security advises you exit quietly. No speech after this. He nodded, barely noticing the sting. JD wrapped up, the applause now a thin echo. Without fanfare, he stepped away from the microphone, slid off the stage and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted, not with respect, but with relief. Outside, cameras snapped furiously as he moved through the lobby. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. He didn't look back. JD exited the building and slipped into the quiet of a waiting car. The driver asked if he wanted to talk to reporters. He shook his head. The car pulled away. Behind him, the conference lights faded into the night. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. And inside the halls of power, whispers turned into an unspoken decree. J.D. Vance was no longer welcome. But amid the silence, something else stirred. A quiet resolve. The kind born not from applause, but from enduring the absence of it. J.D. leaned back, eyes closed, mind racing. Not with regret, but with the faintest glimmer of purpose. Because sometimes the loudest moments come in silence. J.D.'s office was quiet when the letter arrived, just the way he preferred it these days. No emails pinging insistently, no urgent texts demanding attention, just a single envelope, handwritten and a little worn around the edges. He stared at it for a moment before breaking the seal, as if reluctant to open something that might carry yet another burden. But when he pulled the folded page free, the words inside reached straight through the noise, the anger, the isolation. The letter was from a high school student, not from Washington, D.C. or any political hub, from a small town in Ohio. Dear Senator Vance, it began, my dad says you're a traitor, that you've turned your back on the movement. But I don't think so. You're the first person I've seen who's brave enough to say what everyone else is too scared to say. JD's eyes lingered on the words, his mind flashing back to his own youth, not so long ago, when truth was simpler and courage felt like a spark waiting to catch. The letter continued, I don't understand everything about politics, but I know when someone is honest. When someone cares more about the people than the power. And that's what you're doing. You're not alone. I believe in you. For a long time, JD just held the letter, letting its quiet conviction fill the space around him. It was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of cynicism and doubt. He thought of the people who had called him names, those who had whispered in corridors and sent biting messages in the dead of night, the ones who said he'd lost his way. But here was a teenager, untouched by the bitter politics, seeing something he had nearly forgotten himself, the power of truth to inspire, even when it hurts. JD folded the letter carefully and set it aside on his desk. His gaze drifted to the framed photo resting nearby. The familiar face of Donald Trump, smiling broadly as he shook hands with supporters at a rally. The photo was a relic of a past that felt both distant and unresolved. For a moment, the two images, the letter and the photo, seemed to sit in silent conversation. One spoke of hope, the other of history. One carried the future, the other the weight of what had been. JD reached out and placed the letter beside the photo, as if bridging that gap himself. He sat back, the room still around him, but something inside shifting. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, because even when the noise tried to drown out the voice of reason, even when the halls grew cold and the allies disappeared, there were still those who watched, those who listened, and sometimes all it took was one letter to remind a man why he'd started. JD looked out the window at the fading light of the day. The city hummed quietly below, unaware of the quiet battle playing out in a small office high above. But inside there was a flame, not loud or flashy, not meant to burn down the walls, but enough to light a path forward. The legacy he hoped to leave wasn't in headlines or sound bites. It was in moments like this. A simple note from a young believer reminding him that courage matters, and that sometimes the hardest truths are the most necessary. JD picked up the letter again and smiled faintly. Tomorrow would come with its own battles. But tonight, there was peace. The phone rang in JD's quiet office just as twilight faded into night. The soft chime broke the stillness, a reminder that even in isolation, the world kept turning, and sometimes voices found a way through the silence. JD glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed an unlisted number, but he recognized the voice immediately when he answered. Senator Vance, the voice said, low and careful. It's been a difficult few weeks. I won't pretend otherwise. JD's jaw tightened. I'm listening. The voice belonged to a senior figure in the party, someone who had once been an unshakable pillar of influence, now cautious and measured, like a man navigating a minefield. We need you, the caller said, voice almost a whisper. But not like this. Not in public. JD exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the invisible weight of the moment. What do you mean? He asked. There are conversations happening, the voice continued, behind closed doors away from the cameras. We want to bring you back in, but the way forward is delicate. You have to understand, truth spoken in the open is dangerous for the coalition. It fractures the base. It gives ammunition to the opposition. JD leaned back in his chair, the old familiar conflict rising inside him, the choice between safety and secrecy and risk and openness. He thought about the crowds, the reporters, the lonely walk down empty corridors, the ache of being the outsider in his own party. Then he spoke, voice steady, firm. The truth doesn't live in rooms locked tight, JD said. It doesn't thrive in whispers or behind closed doors. There was a pause. I understand the need for strategy, he added, but I won't sacrifice honesty for convenience. The silence stretched. On the other end, the voice weighed the words carefully. Then you're more alone than you think, the caller finally said. JD didn't answer right away, because he knew it was true, but he also knew something else. That courage was never meant to be comfortable, and that change, real change, began in the light, even when it burned. He stood and looked out the window toward the distant glow of the Capitol dome. I'll keep fighting, he said quietly, but on my terms and in the open. The line went dead. JD set the phone down gently. In the quiet of the night, that single call felt like a spark. Not a promise, not a peace treaty, but a challenge. And JD Vance was ready. The hearing room was packed to capacity. Cameras lined the walls like silent sentinels, their lenses trained on the small podium at the center. Journalists whispered behind microphones. Staffers exchanged quiet murmurs. Across the aisle, faces from both parties watched intently, each anticipating the closing words that might shift the fragile balance of power. JD Vance stood alone at the lectern, the weight of months pressing into his shoulders. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar and unfamiliar alike, opponents and supporters, skeptics and hopefuls. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The words he was about to speak had been forged through struggle, shaped by doubt and conviction alike. They were more than political statements. They were a call to conscience. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all present, JD began, voice clear and resolute. I come before you not to defend a party or a person, but to speak for a movement, and for the millions who see their futures entwined with it. He paused, letting the gravity sink in. MAGA is not a man. It is not a slogan. It is a challenge to the complacency and corruption that have too long plagued our country. But it is a challenge that can only succeed if it remains true to its promise, if it embraces not just loyalty, but accountability. The room remained hushed. Even the most cynical leaned in. JD's voice grew firmer. Today we face a choice, to protect the past with silence or to build the future with honesty. The movement cannot survive if it becomes a shield for the unjust or a refuge for the dishonest. He looked directly into the cameras. I speak for those who have felt betrayed, who have been told to look away when truth was inconvenient. For the veterans, the working families, the everyday Americans whose hopes are bigger than any one leader. And so I say this, not as a final attack, but as a final call. If we lose sight of who we serve, we lose everything. He stepped back, voice softened, but no less powerful. The flame of this movement must stay, not as a blind torch carried by a single figure, but as a steady light held by all who believe in justice, integrity, and the promise of America. A murmur of agreement stirred. JD nodded once and took his seat, the live broadcast cutting to commentary and analysis. The press conference room was crowded, but the air was heavy with something new, a sense of reflection. JD's words from the hearing echoed through the halls and into the homes of millions. MAGA is not a person, he told reporters later, his tone thoughtful. It's a movement, a test of values and courage. He recounted stories from rallies in small towns, from faces in the crowd who had once found hope in Trump's promise. It's not because I love Donald Trump, JD explained, but because I love the people who believed in that hope. And if that hope is forgotten or betrayed, then it's our duty to remind the movement what it truly stands for. Journalists pressed for more, but JD remained focused. If the man who inspired a movement forgets its people, then it's up to us, all of us, to carry the torch forward. He paused, eyes steady. That's not a threat, it's a responsibility. The phrase quickly made headlines and reverberated across social media. Some hailed it as a courageous declaration, others decried it as betrayal. But JD stood firm. For him, this was never about loyalty to a single figure. It was about fidelity to a cause greater than any individual, a cause that demanded honesty, even when it hurt. The hearing had ended. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, soft droplets tapping the marble steps like a quiet rhythm. JD adjusted his coat collar and pulled a hat from his bag, setting it carefully on his head. His fingers fumbled briefly with the buttons of his coat before fastening them once more. A young aide stepped beside him, voice low and concerned. "Senator, are you okay?" JD looked up, meeting the gray sky above. He didn't smile. His eyes carried the weight of the day, and the days to come. "I'm not sure," he said honestly, "but at least I'm not lying to myself anymore." The aide nodded quietly, understanding more than words could say. Together they walked down the steps, the rain misting their faces, the city unfolding before them, a place of conflict and hope, of endings and beginnings. And as JD took each step forward, he carried with him something that no storm could wash away, the flame that stays. This story reminds us that true leadership demands courage, not just to speak truths that others avoid, but to stand firm when doing so costs us dearly. JD Vance's journey reflects a universal struggle, balancing loyalty with integrity and choosing to prioritize the greater good over personal gain or political convenience. In a world where silence often seems easier than confrontation, his willingness to face uncomfortable realities head-on offers a powerful lesson. It's a call for all of us to examine our own values and the ways we contribute to the communities and movements we believe in. Are we willing to risk isolation for the sake of honesty? Can we challenge those closest to us when necessary for the sake of progress and justice? This story is not just about politics. It's about the human spirit's capacity to seek truth and light, even amid darkness and division. It encourages us to carry our own flames of conviction, no matter how faint, and to keep them alive for the sake of what truly matters. What truths have you been hesitant to speak, and how might facing them change your own path or community? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.